The history books have a convenient label for her. They call her the most beautiful woman in the world. It was a title bestowed upon her by the studio moguls of the 1930s, plastered across cinema marquees from Vienna to Los Angeles. To the public, Hedy Lamarr was the scandalous siren of ecstasy, the untouchable goddess of the silver screen who existed solely to be looked at, to be desired, to be consumed by the lens. But this title was not a compliment. It was a cage. It was a gilded prison that history constructed around her, a dazzling mask that suffocated the true brilliance hidden beneath the surface. For decades, the world was so mesmerized by the symmetry of her face that it completely ignored the dangerous capacity of her mind. While her Hollywood peers spent their evenings at the Trocadero, drowning in champagne and gossip, Hedy Lamarr was living a double life. She would leave the studio lot, scrub off the heavy grease paint, and retreat into the sanctuary of her home. But she didn't retire to a boudoir of silk and mirrors. She went to her drafting table. There, surrounded by blueprints, engineering manuals, and scattered components, the most beautiful woman in the world ceased to exist. In her place sat a relentless inventor, a woman who looked at the world not as a stage, but as a problem waiting to be solved. She wasn't memorizing lines, she was reimagining the mechanics of modern life. Her mind was a restless engine. She looked at the chaos of Los Angeles traffic and sketched out designs for a new kind of traffic stoplight. She looked at the soldiers preparing for war and worried about their hydration, inventing a tablet that would dissolve in water to create a carbonated drink, an effervescent cube she later admitted tasted like shoe polish, but the chemistry was sound. These were not the whims of a bored celebrity. They were the exercises of a natural-born engineer, but the world refused to see it. To the producers, directors, and the adoring public, a woman could be beautiful, or she could be smart, but she could never, ever be both. The tragedy of Hedy Lamarr begins here, not in a failure of intellect, but in a failure of perception. The industry that made her rich demanded she remain a two-dimensional image. Every time she tried to speak of aerodynamics or chemistry, she was politely steered back to discussions of lipstick shades and wardrobe choices. She was surrounded by powerful men who patronized her, who patted her on the head and told her to look pretty for the cameras. They didn't know that the woman smiling vacantly at them had escaped a controlling arms dealer husband in Austria, fleeing into the night with her jewelry sewn into the lining of her coat. They didn't know that she had sat silently at dinner tables in Vienna, absorbing the technical talk of munitions experts and generals, cataloging their secrets in her photographic memory. This was the golden cage she lived in, a world that worshipped her exterior while actively suppressing her interior. The conflict was agonizingly sharp. She possessed the intellect to change the course of history, yet she was trapped in a body that society viewed as nothing more than an exquisite object. As the shadow of World War II lengthened across Europe, tearing apart the home she had left behind, Hedy knew she could not simply sit and pose. The headlines screamed of U-boats and tyranny. The world was burning, and she had the tools to help put out the fire. But she also knew the cruelest truth of her existence. In the eyes of the establishment, a pin-up girl had no business tampering with the machinery of war. By 1940, the war in the Atlantic had turned into a slaughter. German U-boats were hunting Allied ships with terrifying efficiency, and Hedy Lamarr, reading the reports with a grim intensity, understood exactly why. The problem was guidance. The Allies were using radio-controlled torpedoes, but the technology was fatally flawed. The radio signals that guided these weapons were broadcast on a single frequency. It was child's play for the Nazis to find that frequency and jam it, sending the torpedoes off course or causing them to spin harmlessly in the water. The devastating result was dead sailors and sinking supply ships. Hedy knew the physics. She understood the vulnerability. The signal needed to be unbreakable. Her solution was as elegant as it was revolutionary: frequency hopping. Instead of broadcasting on one static channel, the transmitter and receiver would jump together from frequency to frequency in a synchronized dance. Like a conversation shifting languages every split second, the signal would be impossible to intercept and impossible to jam. The enemy wouldn't know where the signal was, and by the time they found it, it would have already moved. It was a brilliant concept, but she needed a mechanism to make it work. She found her partner in the most unlikely of places, not a military laboratory, but a Hollywood dinner party. George Antel was an avant-garde composer known for his cacophonous ballet mechanic, which synchronized 16 player pianos. Where others saw noise, Hedy saw a mechanism. She realized that the perforated paper rolls that controlled the player pianos could be miniaturized to control radio frequencies. Together, on the floor of her living room, amidst sketches and music sheets, the actress and the composer built the future. They designed a system that used a slotted paper roll, similar to a piano roll, to synchronize the frequency hops between the ship and the torpedo. They coded it to hop across 88 frequencies, a poetic nod to the 88 keys on a piano. It was a masterpiece of electromechanical engineering. In 1942, they were granted U.S. Patent 2292387 for a secret communication system. This should have been the moment of triumph. Hedy Lamarr, the immigrant star, had handed the United States Navy a weapon that could neutralize the Nazi submarine threat. She walked into the National Inventors Council, patent in hand, ready to serve her adopted country with her mind. But history is rarely kind to those who break its molds. The Navy brass looked at the diagrams, then they looked at Hedy. They didn't see a breakthrough, they saw a joke. They saw a woman stepping out of her lane. The rejection was swift, patronizing, and devastating. One officer reportedly sneered at the idea of putting a player piano inside a torpedo. They lacked the imagination to see the metaphor and the respect to see the genius. They told her in no uncertain terms that her technology was too cumbersome and unfeasible, but the insult went deeper. They told her that the most valuable asset she possessed was her sex appeal. They urged her to use her fame to sell war bonds. It was a crushing, humiliating dismissal. A mathematical genius had offered them a shield against tyranny, and they told her to be a cheerleader. They took her patent, stamped it secret, and locked it away in a dusty file cabinet, effectively burying a technology that was decades ahead of its time. The injustice was absolute. The Navy preferred to let ships sink than to admit that a Hollywood actress knew more about radio communications than their own admirals.
Hedy Lamarr did as she was told. It is perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this story, the compliance of a spirit broken by institutional sexism. She didn't storm the press, she didn't fight the admirals. She put on her makeup, wore her best gowns, and went on tour to sell war bonds. She sold kisses to sailors, raising millions of dollars for a government that had spat on her intellectual contribution. She played the role of the patriotic starlet to perfection, smiling for the flashbulbs while her patent, the secret communication system, gathered dust in a government archive. She watched from a distance as the war ended, her invention unused, her potential unrealized. The silence lasted for nearly 20 years. Hedy's patent expired in 1959. She never made a single dime from the idea that would eventually change the world. It wasn't until the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 that the Navy quietly dusted off her concept. The technology had finally caught up with her vision. They implemented a version of her frequency-hopping spread spectrum on naval ships to secure communications during the blockade. But even then, there was no press release, no medal, no phone call to the aging actress living in seclusion. Her name was wiped from the technical manuals.
The engineers who built upon her work likely had no idea that the foundation of their secure comms was laid by the star of Samson and Delilah. As the decades rolled on, the digital revolution began to take shape. The principles of frequency hopping moved from military secrets to consumer electronics. It became the bedrock of modern wireless communication. Every time you connect to Wi-Fi, every time you pair a Bluetooth device, every time your GPS triangulates your position, you are using the technology Hedy Lamarr invented on her living room floor in 1940. Ideally, she should have been celebrated as a pioneer of the information age. Instead, she was living a recluse's life in Florida, her beauty fading, her mind still sharp but largely forgotten by a world that only cared about her old movies. It took 50 years for the silence to break. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation finally unearthed the truth and awarded Hedy Lamarr and George Antile the Pioneer Award. By then, Hedy was 86 years old. She lived alone, communicating with the outside world mostly by telephone, a device her invention had helped evolve. When they called to tell her she was finally being recognized for her mind, not her face, her response was sharp, witty, and laced with half a century of accumulated cynicism. She didn't cry, she didn't thank them profusely. She simply said, "Well, it's about time." It was a vindication, yes, but it was a late one. Hedy died 3 years later, in 2000. Her ashes were scattered in the Vienna woods, but her true legacy is invisible, pulsing through the air around us at this very moment. We live in a world built on her rejected ideas. The tragedy of Hedy Lamarr is not just that she was underestimated, it is that we will never know what else she might have invented if the world had simply listened. She was a giant of science, disguised as a glamour queen, and when she offered us the future, we told her to smile. Today, we must speak her name not just as a star, but as the architect of the modern world who was erased by the very history she helped to save.